experience in Indonesia, because we found out that Tim actually speaks Indonesian very well. So you could tell me a bit more about your history and how you came to be a climate expert.
Yeah, thanks so much, Suzy. Well, look, I've had a long experience with this extraordinary country of yours. I first came here in 1983 and met a real legend of science here in Indonesia, a man called Pak Bowadi. And Bowadi was working at the museum in Bogor and had done incredible things in his life. He had caught Sumatran rhinoceroses and tagged them for different things, and even trapped tigers in the 50s and 60s and done scientific survey work with them. Slept in the treetops and heard the tigers walking below him. Amazing man. So a few years later, I had the opportunity of working with Lipi and with Pak Bowadi, doing faunal survey work in Maluku and in Papua. And we found there just extraordinary biodiversity, but also untouched in a way. So many new species. So we were able to describe tree kangaroos, kanguru pohon, about this big, beautiful animals that were just unknown to science. So I had a wonderful 10 years, I guess, with Pak Bowadi, wandering the mountains of West Papua and Maluku, and just making these really interesting discoveries.
Wow, it was fascinating to learn that you had spent so much time in our country. And I can testify that Tim speaks very good Indonesian, actually.
Terima kasih banyak. But you know, 30 tahun lalu bahasa Indonesia saya ada lebih pintar. Saya sudah lupa banyak ya.
Oh gitu ya, masih bagus sekarang. Terima kasih Pak Tim. And maybe you can tell us more about how you came to be in the field of climate change, because I know your biography says you were, you know, a biologist and in the species, and how did they come to be?
Well, I ask myself that question quite often because for 25 years I had the best job in the world. I was a mammalogist in a museum and I could travel anywhere on the planet and do whatever I wanted really, as long as I was researching mammals. But I got to a stage in my career where I'd advanced to being a museum director, and I was given additional responsibilities by a state government and started researching climate change in a much more serious way. So previously I knew about it, but was really always pushing it away a bit because I was so busy, yeah? But once I started really engaging with it, I realised this is the great challenge of our age. And unless someone does something about this, we're going to be in serious trouble. And I realised at that point, well, the only person I can influence to that extent is me. So I need to change what I do. So I gave up my career as a biologist and just launched out on climate activism, really. I wrote a book called The Weather Makers, which was an attempt to tell other people about why I was so concerned about this problem. And from there, really, I guess that's been my life, has been involved in climate activism, along with biodiversity conservation, because those things go hand in hand, really.
Right. Could you tell us a bit more about how climate change and biodiversity are related?
Yeah, sure. Well, you know, I was watching that incredible trailer before the movie, and you look at that world. It's so beautiful, pristine world, huh? And you think, nobody needs to do anything to keep that world like that. The world is a self-cleansing place, right? So it is only us, as we become incredibly selfish and stupid and polluting of that world, that we create a sewer out of it, yeah? So for me, I know the world can sustain us in a most beautiful and harmonious way if we give it a chance. But every time a species goes extinct, that is one less element in this world which is self-maintaining, yeah? And the world becomes a less rich, less interesting, less competent place. So I guess I've just understood inherently that we need desperately to take care of biodiversity. So, you know, one of the things I've done in the last 20 years is established a group called Australian Wildlife Conservancy in Australia. We realised the National Park Service wasn't doing as good a job as we'd like to conserve biodiversity. So we set up an independent organisation that now controls an area of land a third as big as the national parks, and looks after the great majority of Australia's endangered species. And that's just from concerned individuals helping out, putting in some money, getting organised and doing something.
That's a marvelous example. That's activism, isn't it?
It really is. It's not quite on the epic scale of Greenpeace and that sort of thing, but it is activism of a more everyday variety.
And on climate change, Tim, a recent article from the World Economic Forum says we only have a window of 3 years to really do something about climate change. What do you think about that?
Well, I can only agree, sadly. We're in a situation now where we are putting 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide, so greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide equivalent, into the atmosphere every year. So how big is 50 gigatons? It's a massive stream. If you wanted to take just 10% of that out of the atmosphere, so just 5 gigatons out, you'd need to cover the entire USA in forests. It's a massive, massive scale. So we need to start cutting very hard and very fast the use of fossil fuels. Now we know we can do that. In most of the parts of the world now, we can produce energy cheaper from wind, solar or other means than we can through oil or coal.
Right.
So we just need to break that nexus, break the vested interest and move on to that better future.
Yeah, that's what Greenpeace believes, that renewable futures, the futures in renewables. But as you can see in Indonesia and maybe in Australia as well, the coal mines are still, expanding, and it's, we're trying to build big power stations powered with coal in Indonesia.
Well, that's crazy, I'm sorry to say. I mean, in Australia, for the last 15 years, or 10 years anyway, 100% of energy installation has been renewable. Because it's cheaper.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, it is
it's
cheaper.
Amazing.
Right? So no one is building new coal in Australia. We're closing down our old coal. We're still heavily dependent on coal because we started from a very bad place where 90% of our electricity was generated by coal. But no one in their right mind is building coal-fired power plants today in Australia, and no one should be in Indonesia. You'll find that there is a distortion of the economy for that to happen. Someone is offering something somewhere to make that happen, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense.
That's very true. And I think we need you in Indonesia. You need to go, we have to bring you, Bu Susanti, where are you? I think we need to bring you and have you talk to some of our government in Indonesia. Because I think there's a big discussion on that the scale of renewables will not be enough to catch up with the demand that we have with our growing population.
Well, let's take the example. If that is true, then you'll never catch up with coal. We know what the world would look like, what Indonesia would look like if you tried to use coal to do that. It would look like more than China, where the air is unbreathable, the water is undrinkable, and the food is inedible. Because the coal plants pollute soils with cadmium, with other mercury and other toxic materials. They use so much water. 20% of Victoria's water use, where I live in southern Australia, goes to cooling coal-fired power plants. 20% of water. So. So we know that if you want to really damage your environment, then you will take the less efficient pathway of using coal, right?
Yeah, that's a big shake-up, isn't it? It's always about the powers that be and the sort of the established system.
That's right. Someone owns coal mines, someone wants to sell coal, someone will offer some cheap financing from government. All of that stuff feeds into an unvirtuous loop which keeps you where you are and doesn't allow you to move forward.
Well, besides the issue of coal, as you know, Indonesia, a big issue is about deforestation. Yeah. And I know you were here 30 years ago and you saw our pristine nature. And as you know, there's a big controversy in Indonesia because palm oil obviously is a big income earner and it's helping people's lives, but at the same time, it's got to do with deforestation. What's your view on that?
It's true. I remember in Papua flying from one end of the country to the other across Hutan Lindungi for 2 hours, and seeing not even a village. It was such an amazing thing. I don't really want to go back because I know that would have changed, now. I'd love to go back, but I fear going back because of that. But You know, I've seen palm oil development in the western part of Indonesia, in Kalimantan.
In Sumatra, especially.
Yeah, and I'm really torn by this because it is very clear that we need to generate usable oils for humanity. There's an ever-growing number of people. Yeah, so we have to have that. But when I look at the on-the-ground practice of oil palm plantations in Indonesia, I see how incredibly wasteful and stupid they are. So, you know, what I saw in Kalimantan, everything is cleared from the valley to the hilltop. And yet you look at the oil palm trees, the ones on the hilltop are this tall and producing nothing. So why would you do that? Why would you put the energy into doing that instead of leaving the forest above a certain, altitude, yeah? And why wouldn't you protect your biodiversity in those oil palm places? So, you know, at the moment we see badak, even rhinos killed in Kalimantan.
In Kalimantan.
Yeah, which is...
in Sumatra mostly, yeah.
Whereas that should be the most precious asset of the country. You know, the death of a rhino, there's so few now, should be mourned nationally, and a huge fine levied against anyone who does that. I think we can have oil palm, forest, and biodiversity surviving side by side if we approach it sensibly and don't ask too much. You know, don't try to take the last scrap.
That's I think you're a really unique person, because most people say don't use palm oil, or some people say, you know, forget about Greenpeace and all these people, we'll just, you know, go for the money. You know, how do you balance these things? What do you think are the critical factors in order to be able to achieve this balance?
I really think the critical factor is our culture and what we accept. You know, we humans are now so powerful, we are the minds over the land in a very real way, and what is in our mind will manifest on the ground. So if you live in Jakarta with that incredible air pollution and all of that, that's come about from the collective minds, the collective actions of people, and it can change. That can be made into a beautiful city, probably at less cost than the current cost, because all of that pollution is waste, yeah? Right. So thinking clearly and carefully about what we want is what's necessary. And beyond that, there is a very important human factor at work, which is that individually, if we are left to our own devices, we can do terrible things, because we can be selfish without the censure of others, yeah? And people who get into very wealthy and influential positions can become quite selfish in the way they live and work. Good governance is all about making sure that the voices of everyone is heard, so that that censure can be heard, so we all become better people. So ultimately, in a way, the environmental problems are a subset of governance problems. They're about us and how we manage us.
It's a mindset change, isn't it, that we need to achieve to appreciate nature, because I think in Indonesia we have so much of it. I mean, we grew up with, you know, even now in Bali, you walk around, there are always trees, so you never think it's valuable in a way. It's just a tree because it's always been there, and yet there are things we have to preserve. Are there any lessons from Australia about this? You know, appreciating something and trying to figure out what's the value of it? Like you mentioned, if we had a rhino die, and how do you quantify that? How do you convince people this biodiversity is worthwhile?
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure what it's like here in Indonesia at the individual level with that sort of thing, Suzy, but I don't meet anyone who thinks extinction is a good idea. I don't meet anyone who thinks air pollution is a great idea either. Right?
Yeah.
So I think collectively we have wisdom about this. We understand what is right and wrong. You know? It's a matter of somehow letting that collective wisdom become part of our politics. That's the issue. Adequate representation of that wisdom is the thing. So, and we're at a very primitive stage, really, of our political development, if you want, at the moment, and we have often relatively weak governance around the areas that really count,
right.
And that's what needs to change.
Is that just in Indonesia, or is that in Australia? How does it?
It's everywhere. It's everywhere. And you know, you asked about lessons from Australia. Look, I hate to say it, but in Australia, faith in government is declining year on year. In fact, many Australians I speak to no longer expect government to act responsibly. They're so used to government being ineffective or not doing what's needed.
Really?
Yeah, it's sad. I mean, not everyone, obviously, but there's a growing discontent with government. And so what we are seeing in many areas is people doing it for themselves. So Australian Wildlife Conservancy, that I just talked about, it's now a $20 million a year organisation conserving biodiversity, just using donations from the public. People no longer expect government to do that. We know we have to do it ourselves. In terms of cleaning up our democracy, there are other organisations such as Get Up and things like this which are doing the same sort of thing. And I find more and more when I talk to younger people, they understand that they can organise using social media and so forth to do some of this. So maybe that's the lesson for Indonesia, is that don't place all of your faith in government to do everything right. You may need to get out there and do something yourself.
Thank you. That's really an important thing. I think we've lived for a long time under a very strong government.
Yeah.
And for myself, a bit of disclosure, I am a board member of Greenpeace, and I find that the Greenpeace movement is one that's given power to people to be able to do something, get up and support or do a petition and things like that.
Could I just take issue with you on one thing, Suzy? You said you've lived for a very long time under a strong government, but this government has proved that it cannot control logging, for example.
Right.
So it actually is a weak government.
Okay.
It may seem strong in repressing those who oppose logging, but it cannot actually do anything to protect the true values of Indonesia, the true natural values of Indonesia. It's proved impossible to clean up the pollution or slow the pollution in places like Jakarta. So it's not a strong government.
Yeah, that means the people have to form communities, right?
Yeah.
To act as a community to do the right thing. I mean, even in Bali, I think we have a need for that. As you notice, how does Australia, or your own view perhaps, on tourism and nature?
Wow,
and biodiversity.
Look, I was thinking about this today, thinking, if the Balinese had known 40 years ago what was coming, what should they have done? And I think they should have organised in their communities to develop a very clear-cut set of laws and regulations that they agreed to, which they would stand by to the very last and make sure they wouldn't transgress. And then I think you would have had a perfectly acceptable and wonderful, no regrets development of tourism in the place. But I hope people don't mind me saying, I think that we've had a less than optimal outcome here. You look at the road system and transport and so forth. So yes, there's many good things it's brought, but it could have been done better. Yeah.
Yes, I think we all know that the rule about not having buildings taller than a coconut tree, that's been just really wonderful for Bali.
Yeah.
But I think it's hard sometimes for a local population or even a community to imagine 40 years into the future what kind of policy and regulations are necessary. Even today, I think the government in Bali is still struggling to understand that.
I think that's true, and no one can do this perfectly. But I draw my inspiration from places like Europe, where you see city boundaries that have been stable since medieval times. They've been set, and that is the boundary of the city. And you cannot, within that city, you have to respect the old building fabric. You can't build on the fields outside, and they're very strong local governments and very strong identity around some of those rules. So, and I guess that comes from living in the one place a very long time. Us Australians, we're new settlers in the land. So we don't have that sense of belonging. I think that, I feel with many Indonesians, I mean, we were discussing earlier, Suzy, that people here knew how to do sustainable agriculture. You've been doing it for thousands of years.
That's right,
Whereas
we did.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas in Australia, we came from Europe and tried to apply European agriculture to a land where it was a disaster. So we have had to learn anew how to do that. So you have some advantages here, perhaps.
Yeah, I think we did, but we had the whole Green Revolution, which totally changed the face of our agriculture with this fast-growing rice strains and having more crop, but then with a lot of chemical input. So it's really hard. I mean, Bali is struggling now to go back to more sustainable agriculture, and it's a struggle.
Yeah, I really understand that. And you're in the Australian farming sector that I watch a bit, you see the same thing, that those farmers who are doing it, who are becoming more sustainable in their practice, they face enormous opposition from the farmers around them because they don't use fertilisers.
That's
so people
right.
will say, but that means the local fertiliser producer will go broke if you don't use fertiliser. So that'll be damaging our economy and so forth. So there are pressures on those people, yeah, which is difficult to resist. Yeah.
Back to climate change a little bit. What do you think is going to happen the next, we chatted a little bit and you said 10, 20 years?
Yeah, look, we're already seeing some pretty major impacts. The Great Barrier Reef is now in very serious trouble, and in fact coral reefs globally are not doing well. But for the Barrier Reef, I remember diving on the Great Barrier Reef in 1972, 4 years before the first coral bleaching event ever occurred, and it was fabulous, And I didn't think it was so special back then, but now I know how precious that was. I was back on the Barrier Reef again. I've been back many times, but back again this year to an area that had back to black bleaching. So for the first time ever last year and this year, we had 2 bleaching events in succession, right? And you see the damage that's being done. 80% or so of the Great Barrier Reef now is dead coral.
80%?
80% around about. It's between
Is there a chance of recovery for that?
Well, that's, as a scientist, I have to say we don't know, right? But if you look at the last 30 years and just project that out, it doesn't look good, huh? So just follow this. We have to do something different. We have to change direction. And we see in southern Australia now that the climate has really changed as well. We're getting longer dry periods and more intense rainfall periods when the rain does come. So our climate is changing around us. We are seeing problems. But those really are just the beginning, the first symptoms of what will become a much more serious problem in 10 or 20 years' time, because the greenhouse gases are in the air now that will cause that. There's nothing we can do about that. We see the problems intensify.
Well, that's, because in Indonesia we have so much coral reefs. Is it something that I know we've had bleaching, but not quite as serious as Australia. Yeah. And we're in the coral triangle. I mean, what does the future hold for us in Indonesia?
I haven't done the research to be able to answer that fully, Suzy, but what I can say is that as we get these underwater heat waves building up and devastating coral, it's becoming an issue everywhere. Now, some corals, like in the Red Sea, they can sustain much higher temperatures than those elsewhere. I hope that your corals are robust in that regard, but sadly ours in Australia are not.
Well, we're keeping our fingers crossed there. I know this morning you had a presentation on sunlight and seaweed. Is that something to do with climate change?
Well, it is. I think that there are some real potential solutions to the problem, which we will develop over decades, but which are quite substantial. In my view, we need to do 2 things now. One is cut emissions as hard and as fast as we can. It's absolutely essential. So every time we've got a choice, go for the cleaner option. Yeah? But we also need to start doing research and development in techniques and methods and technologies that will allow us to draw CO2 out of the air at a big scale. And one of those is reforestation, or even protecting forests can help protect carbon stores. Another big one is rumput laut, the seaweed.
How's that? Can you tell me more? I mean, we have a lot of seaweed, but I don't know if it's the right variety.
Well, all seaweed grows really fast. It sequesters lots of carbon, and if that seaweed makes it into the deeper ocean, it sequesters that carbon. So you have a lot of seaweed farms around the coast of Indonesia already. But there's a very interesting one being developed off Aceh at the moment, which is being funded partly through Australian foreign aid, which is a deep sea seaweed farm. So it's bringing water from the deep ocean, colder water with nutrients in it, and using that to irrigate a crop of seaweed. It floats about 25 metres below the surface. And people are thinking that the produce from that, the estimates are that it will produce around about $1 million worth of product a year,
really?
Which is great, yeah.
Wow. But
if you can do that and then just let the seaweed sink into the deep ocean, you've sequestered carbon as well. So, the scale that would be required on to make a difference is massive, but I think in future, as we start to value that carbon, we'll see that. Because you think about the carbon in the atmosphere, that will be driving adverse change for many decades. So if you've got a solution to get some of that carbon out of the air, that's like money in the bank. And I really hope that young Indonesians and young Australians who are thinking about careers, thinking about agriculture, aquaculture, technology, whatever else, will start thinking about things this way, because they will be able to really make a difference over the decades to this problem by doing things like developing the right sort of seaweed farming and making carbon negative concretes, which already exist but we can use at
They
scale.
absorb carbon, right?
Yeah,
as they age.
absolutely,
Like that.
yeah, amazing solution, huh? Fantastic stuff. Even silicate rocks, which are very common in Indonesia, we can use them to reinforce our beaches that are eroding, and they will draw down CO2.
Really?
So there are lots
Wow.
of solutions for the future.
Wow, that's great. I believe that too. I believe sustainability really hinges on creativity and innovation. I mean, if we keep feeling guilty all the time, you know, what are we going to do, right? We're just going to sit down and weep.
That's
But
right.
we need more energy for you know, activism, like we're going to watch, and also for innovation and creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the key. And for me, the key is as much imagination. We need to be able to imagine a better future, a better sort of society. And if we can unlock our imagination to do that, then we're empowered to achieve something wonderful.
Thank you very much. That's such a strong message of hope for us in Southeast Asia, especially in Indonesia, where half the time I think those of us who work in the, you know, sort of in the activism field, we feel like it's all uphill because the government. But, you know, I think sometimes we forget that there's so much that can be done.
Yeah.
And having, you know, we took a little time to look at the trailer for the Greenpeace movie. Maybe could you tell us a little bit what you think about it and what kind of message it provides?
Well, I think, you know, these guys who set up Greenpeace, 40 years ago now, right? They're kind of my generation. I was in my 20s when that was happening. And you know, I'm full of admiration for them, because they said, look, for us, activism is about giving it everything, giving it our whole life, you know. And not everyone can do that, but activism is something everyone can do at some level. So if people here watching this movie, if you want to become activists, could I suggest when you go out of this theatre and you see someone throw away a bit of plastic, or you see some rubbish in the street, pick it up, give it back to the person who threw it, or put it in a bin. It's a strong act of activism, because the person thinks, wow, I didn't think about that, you know. So whatever you do that way, do something when we leave that is an act of activism, I think, and continue on.
Thank you very much. It's a strong message, I think, for all of us, that it all begins with you, basically. Yeah,
That's absolutely
and be a good example, and people will follow.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think we have some time for questions. MC? Thank you.
Would you like to point to the questions, Suzy?
Is somebody going to do that, or okay? I guess we could do it.
Yeah, we can.
I think this
lady in the front is
that's
waiting.
right.
Yeah.
Tim, I've just got a question. I need to frame it up first to use some context. So my question really is around trying to impact meaningfully and with some really serious traction, educating youth, educating the community properly, as opposed to reading the newspaper in Australia every Saturday and thinking that articles about climate change are being truthful or in any way educational, because they're not. So my situation is, we lived here for 6 months last year. I had my two children go to green school. It's all about creating a sustainable world. One of them stayed, one of them's gone back to Australia. So my question is very personal, because what my youngest child's faced back in Australia, which is my question, is no one cares, no one knows, and she's incredibly frustrated. So it's a common story for children that might be more aware. I read the papers we've discussed on a regular basis since returning to Australia. I'm so frustrated about the level of ignorance, and I am no expert, but I know enough to know, oh my God, we've got to do something. And I just wonder how we get over what is, from my point of view, serious propaganda from corporates, serious globalisation, serious impact on... They're not even children learning about climate change in science classes. So what's your perspective about how do we make that get some traction
Yeah, I mean, they're really, really great questions. Look, can I start with something positive, really? I think that at primary school level, you know, in Australia, teachers are doing a tremendous job in terms of helping to foster respect for nature and a basic understanding of the way the world works and so forth. I guess when you get into those higher levels, it's harder to teach climate science. It becomes more controversial and more political, and I'd love to see that change. I really would. But you know, when I started my climate activism, you couldn't do a climate science degree at university because they didn't exist. You know, so we're moving forward in some ways, and I think that some of the pushback we're getting from the corporates and from the newspaper is because of our success. We are starting to succeed. So your daughter's frustration, in a way, is a very powerful tool. She will never forget that. She'll never forget how bad things were, and hopefully that will motivate her. Is it a presumed daughter? Yeah. To do things. So I don't have an immediate solution for teaching climate science in schools. I wish we could do that, but you know, we're in the middle of a real struggle at the moment in Australia, where the fossil fuel lobbies and so forth effectively control government. Government no longer represents the people in that sense, and therefore we're in the middle of this big struggle. So I can only empathise with you.
Thank you. So second, I think it was that gentleman there.
Thanks very much for the great talk, Tim, and for the presentation earlier today. My question is related to this, and it's about the psychology of people's beliefs around climate change. What have you found to be compelling in changing people's views from people who are skeptical to actually being able to get traction around understanding or being interested in learning about climate change? It seems that there's a bit of skepticism which almost sees climate change as being a bit of a religion or a political campaign, rather than simply discussion about the facts of what scientists are seeing in the world.
Sure. Look, I was Climate Commissioner in Australia for 3 years, and I spoke to probably 20,000 Australians face-to-face in forums like this about climate change. And I came away from that experience hugely impressed with the common sense and wisdom, really, of the average people in Australia. And I began to understand the roots of some of this climate scepticism. And for some people, it is simply mercenary. People like Andrew Bolt make their living from opposing it, right? And there are a few very wealthy people who want to oppose it because it affects their economics, right? But there are many other people who either don't have a choice in terms of what they do, or don't have the information. And could I just tell you one story about a man I met in Mackay in Queensland? We talked to a group probably 4 times as big as this, and there was a George Christensen, one of our most climate denialist politicians, was in the room. We gave a short presentation and then asked for questions, and this bloke who was about 6'4", and you could see the coal dust in his skin, you know, stood up, hand went up, and God, we're in for it now, we're going to get slamming. But he got up and said, look, I used to be a farmer, and thank you for your presentation. I now understand that climate change destroyed my business, that the climate variability got too great. He said, but I've got 2 kids, 2 daughters, and I had to find a job and earn money, so I went to work in a coal mine. So can you tell me, am I doing the right thing? And you know, it's kind of that moment where you say, wow, what do you say, you know? And that's the paradigm most of us, I think most Australians are somewhere along that. We want to do the right thing, but we're locked into a system that isn't doing the right thing, right? So in terms of that scepticism, could I just say that the very first thing is to treat everyone with real respect, you know? Some people are rightfully very proud of building the nation through being coal miners, because that was the paradigm they grew up in, you know, that was the way they saw the world. We can't just tell them they've been doing the wrong thing all of their life now. We need to acknowledge that contribution, but move on, you know. So I really think listening is a very big part of the solution of getting to where we want to go. As much as we feel outraged that they're holding us back, we need to somehow find the space to treat people with respect no matter what their view is.
And that's not only in Australia, I think very much it's us here in Indonesia, because so much change has to come about, and there's this conflict, you know, but I appreciate that about the listening. Thank you. And I think there was a...
Somebody
Up there?
Yeah.
Okay. Shall we take one up there first?
Yeah, just wondered, you talked about seaweed farming. I just wondered what your perspective is on fish farming.
On
Fish farming?
Fish farming is just very big in Asia.
Yeah.
And a lot of the fish stocks are plummeting, wild fish stocks. So is fish farming a positive thing or is it a negative?
Yeah.
How do you view it?
Look, thank you. Thanks for the question. Fish farming or aquaculture is a really rapidly evolving area, and at the moment we get more fish from farms than we do out of the ocean wild already. So, and some fish farming is catastrophic in terms of the environment because people have cleared mangroves to create fish ponds, for example, which is a disaster. But in other places, fish farming is done more sustainably. And one place you can see it done more sustainably is off the coast of China, where there are about 500 square kilometres of seaweed farms already. And those seaweed farms are creating a very buffered oceanic environment because the seaweed draws CO2 out of the ocean and therefore deacidifies the ocean. So the seaweed farms are an ideal place to grow fish or shellfish of any kind. And there you're getting highly productive, what people are calling marine permaculture systems, where you're getting an integrated seaweed and fish farming process which is much more sustainable. And I think the right way to go is to foster that sort of more sustainable fish farming.
What about a fish like tilapia? Tilapia in Vietnam, they grow that on a big scale.
So I can't quite hear what you're saying.
Tilapia. The fish tilapia.
Oh, tilapia, yeah. Look, I don't know enough about the exact circumstances of that, but I think that tilapia it's a freshwater fish, growing in ponds, so it's likely to, unless it's done very carefully, to cause problems. I've seen cobia farming in Australia, and unless it's integrated with seaweed farming, it's a gross source of pollutants.
Thank you. And I think, was it? Okay. Sorry if we have the sequence, but...
Hi, how are you going? I'm on the board of one of the 2 environment centres in the Northern Territory, and it's become quite obvious that it's your connection and influence with people that makes a very big difference, has a big impact. And I know we're in Indonesia, but I'm interested in, since you're here, Tim, hearing what is happening in Australia by harnessing that influence that, say, the middle class North Shore of Sydney may have, who may be connected to Malcolm or that kind of thing. How is there actually a strategy in place where people are working from that way for systemic change?
Yeah, look, there are many initiatives aimed at doing that. One of them is the Climate Council, the initiative that I helped set up, which is about crowdfunding a better climate response. But could I say, I don't think the problem is Malcolm. I mean, Malcolm Turnbull probably wants to do the right thing. I mean, I've known him pretty well for 30 years now, and I know where he is. But he's become captive of a political system that is not truly representative of the people of Australia, right? So the problem is one of representation, really. So how do we change that? And I've been mucking around with ideas on this for quite some time, but I've come to the conclusion really that what we need to do is have people, respected members of society, stand for election, not on a party basis, but just as individuals, to say, I will stand for 1 term only, right? 3 years only. I won't take any entitlements. I'll do this as a public service, just take the salary. And I'll only have one objective as a parliamentarian, and that is to help pass a bill which puts all financial matters through a jury system. So a jury system where you might have, say, 100, 150 people chosen at random from society who will be impanelled, paid for their time, they'll be empowered to call any witness they want before them, and then they'll make the decision. Do we want to spend, for example, 2% less on defence and 2% more on health, or where do we want to go? So if we ever got that system up, we would break the nexus between money and politics, we would get a much cleaner kind of politics, and we'd get common sense ruling on our budget, and we would have true representation because we're the taxpayers. But that's the sort of thing we need if we want to break through this representation problem, I think.
Do we have the next question?
Up there.
Oh, hi. Hello, Tim. Thanks so much for the presentation. It's really interesting. Are you looking into the light so you can look
Sorry,
down?
I'm looking straight at the lights.
that's
I'm
fine.
just showing you.
Really, I've got two questions. You partly answered the second one just then, so I'm going to come back to that around the political and policy sort of piece. First question though is I've got a fairly senior role in one of the emergency services in our country, and a lot of research has been undertaken in our country, in Australia, but internationally about major disasters, and they're getting more common, they're getting larger, bushfire seasons are getting longer, floods are getting larger and bigger, etc. internationally. So my first question is, where do you see, we keep hearing it's getting worse, where will it get to, if you have an opinion on that? My second question is about the piece you were just saying then, would you consider sitting in and running as an independent for our government?
Yeah, well, look, yes, I would. I am considering it, but I've got a life to live in the meantime. Giving up 3 years is no small thing. So at the right moment, I will. I feel at the moment's not quite right yet, but I think perhaps in future it might be. But it'll be on that basis only. I would never join a political party or anything. But in terms of emergency services, look, I know exactly the sort of problems you're pointing at, and a lot of people don't understand the ramifications of climate change. So just for those who are not so aware, in terms of firefighting, it used to be the case 3 or 4 decades ago that there was a seasonality to fires, so we'd see them start in Queensland early in the season and progress down south, and what that meant was that people from Tasmania would go to Queensland to help fight the fires early on, and then we'd move around the country. Now, with an overlapping fire season throughout Eastern Australia, it's very hard to do that. We've got a system where all hands are on board, as you know probably better than me, at different times across that. And furthermore, the Northern Hemisphere fire season's now starting to overlap with the Southern Hemisphere one. So availability of some of the heavy infrastructure like the Elvis helicopters, which are flown from one hemisphere to the other, is becoming an issue. So, it's not like it's just an incremental requirement for more funding. We've actually got to think about this in quite a different way now. So I really empathise with you, and I think if we explained the facts to the people and asked them what was required, we would get a very different response from the one you're getting from your political masters at the moment, right? It's a real issue and it's only going to get worse, but these are things that can't be changed instantly. As you know, you cannot train people to do this work instantly. You can't get the infrastructure straight away. So we need a long-term planning strategy, I think, in terms of dealing with this over the coming decades.
Yeah, we only have, maybe about 5 to 6 minutes left. Maybe 2 last questions.
Yes. Hello. Yes, I've got the mic. I just wanted to ask 2 quick questions. One, do you think if they put some sort of transparency, or this is in relation to political parties, transparency in relation to party donations, so that there's some accountability or some sort of rules around that, that would help? And my second question is, how do we get people off their addiction to plastic?
Yeah. Look, I think if we had real-time transparency for political donations, it might help, but I don't think it'll cure the problem, because the temptation is always there if you're a politician for life to act in your own interest or the interests of those who pay you most rather than the people who you're supposed to represent. I really do think we have to think about politics as a public service. Right. It's interesting, Adam Smith and the Division of Labour, right? So he, the economist, who explained how almost everything, if you mechanise it and you get people to specialise in doing one bit of a job, you'll get a better outcome. That's true for everything except politics, right? Because if you get specialist politicians, they'll act in their own interest, right? They won't just be making pinheads. So it's a problem. The plastics issue is genuinely a very, very hard one, particularly plastics in the oceans. We're already seeing very big impacts on birds, seabirds, and in fact microplastics in fish and all the rest of it. I think that's a problem that there's not an easy fix for. That doesn't mean there's not a fix for it. I know there's a group in the Netherlands who are crowdfunding a solution, for example, to clean up the North Pacific Gaia, the North Pacific garbage patch, using the power of the current. But these are things that the next generation, I think, will work on.
Thank you. We have time for one last question.
Thank you, Tim. It's been really great to hear you. My question is about the future. And if you're talking 10 years as a potential point of chaos, I'm just wondering about the cities. I'm just wondering, like a city like Sydney, for example, it's millions of people. What do you think is our preparedness as a big city for these kind of impacts that you're talking about come along?
In terms of preparedness for climate change impacts, I think we're probably reasonably well positioned to deal with a single impact. So the Brisbane flood, for example, was a good example of the sort of thing we might see more of in future, where you get these very large scale, very damaging weather events. So something like that once a decade or so, once every 50 years you could manage. The problem with climate change is with the shifting baseline we get many more such events and a great diversity of such events. So I think that we will be challenged financially, and it's not going to be possible to make good all damage, particularly with rising sea levels in some of these areas. And of course the cost of everything is going to go up unless we get very smart about it. So the cost of water, the cost of food, everything is going to be impacted. So there's no easy fixes for that, but we have to get on top of the problem. So at the moment, the problem's growing every year. I'll be happy if we get to a position where the problem is receding every year. We won't cure it in my lifetime, but at least if it is diminishing year by year, like the ozone hole is, we'll be in a better position.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tim. It's been a great discussion. And I do hope you stand for some office. Because if I'm Australian, I'd vote for you.
Thank you.
And now over to the team to put the movie on, maybe.
Thank you so much, Ibu Suzy. And maybe the last, I would like to ask to the team, what the simple things that we can do to save the world from the climate change?
Wow, the simple things. Be a leader, be an activist with what you do. Wherever, whether it's in your church, your community, your business, just be a leader.
Thank you so much. Please give applause. Before you leave the stage, can we just take a selfie together? Yep.
The younger generation.
So, ladies and gentlemen, sponsored by Greenpeace Southeast Asia, present to you the films about climate change. Save the world. Thank you.
Mr. Sutton, you have an announcement. We'll hand out copies momentarily, so you have to write down what you said. We'll take questions after.
The Atomic Energy Commission is now planning to proceed with the Cannikin test. We have now received the requisite authority to go ahead, including detonation.
On the windswept island of Antigua, final preparations for the test go on. filling the 6,000-foot deep hole with sand. The 5-megaton nuclear bomb rests at the bottom.
Since childhood, when I started making science fiction comics in my school scribblers, I loved to draw. But by the time I got a place at art school, Uncle Sam and Comrade Ivan were pointing 56,000 nuclear warheads at each other. The boys my age were coming back in body bags from Vietnam. The American dream was turning into a planetary nightmare.
AEC scientists say they are not worried. The blast will set off a large earthquake or a tidal wave.
Drawing comics didn't seem to be